This is the Almost Daily Zencast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo.
I don't know why I impulsively pushed that sound effect. No, I am not recording in front of a studio audience. Hello and welcome, friends. Namaste. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. I wasn't sure what I was going to focus on this episode, other than the general notion of my show at large, which is the intersection of spiritual work and political work and social work and economic work. As I was tinkering and getting ready and sort of going, okay, beyond the typical ramblings, what do I want to hone in on? And I thought, why the heck not? Let's see what's been happening on this news platform. Let's look for something interesting to be inspired by. So, yeah, I get it. For those who might have the opinion that the news media is evil and corrupt, I understand that position. I don't agree with it 100%. And I do find certain news platforms seem to be making the effort to actually transcend that paradigm. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about everything, folks. But I humbly suggest to you that nothing in this human system of ours is absolute. That being said, I turned to NPR, National Public Radio, which is, in theory, publicly funded. And although it does take underwriting money from large corporate interests, sometimes really weird ones, it does seem to make an effort as a news agency to maintain that firewall between the agencies and the centers of power that help fund it, because they do get half of their funding from people like you and I who listen and subscribe, but they also take some other big chunks of money from other big interests of various kinds. But they try to be transparent and all about disclosing that sort of stuff. And I digress. I'm not here to argue about whether or not NPR is a reliable news source. I find that they cover issues fairly, that they stick their report, in their reporting, they stick to facts that can be verified to the best of any individual's limited ability to verify them. And they also represent voices that don't get heard as often on other platforms quite as clearly. To that end, I want to give them praise and I don't know the details. I'm just looking at the headline. I want to give them praise for a particular radio article that's up on their website. And as a pseudo amateur influencer, I want to encourage you to go check it out. And maybe if you're the kind of person that thinks my thinking, or the thinking, it's not mine, it's not original to me, although I guess some bits of it are, that if you kind of generally get the vibe that I and many others are trying to share, that you help bring that perspective to that platform, right? Because that's what really, of the many pillars at the center of this project, trying to bring a marginalized community back into the mainstream by saying, hey, we can be media too. And we are, right? Like, there's plenty of people, the whole yoga on Instagram thing is blown up. It's like the number of yoga instructors on Instagram has like exponentially quadrupled. Anyways, I digress. Spiraling out of control. NPR. Make up your mind, but in that process, check out this article. So as you make up your own mind about NPR, if you've never checked them out, go check them out and see if you feel that if they are balanced, if they are stilted, if they're fact-based or not. Decide for yourself. But that requires, of course, challenging your own assumptions, etc., etc. Check out this article. You can find it if you're on NPR. It always asks you, it's neat because they're a network of local radio stations that coordinate together, right? So it asks you to pick your local one. And this article may not be on your local one, but I found it on KVCR from out here near where I live, and you can probably find it on their drop-down list of all their networked stations, I think, when you get asked what station you want to find or you want to listen to. But this article that I'm finally going to read you the headline to, 11 minutes later, is entitled, quote, "Act from a Place of Love." And then the little subheading is 3 religious leaders on how they are responding to recent attacks. Now, I wish I had that awesome media power to just play you the best clip right now, give you the 30-second rundown from within the article. But to respect their rights, right? I'm not out willingly, knowingly, or maliciously trying to infringe on anyone's creative or financial rights. But I do believe in sharing stuff worth sharing, etc. So I'm going to tell you what I felt, my impressions listening to it. They did a really beautiful thing that we need more of, I humbly think. I think many of us might agree. We need more of the following in our general public discourse. There were 3, it says so right there in the article, right in the headline, 3 religious leaders. So there was, and you'll forgive me, I don't have their names in front of me. I don't have their official titles as spiritual officiants. And my memory is, vague in that way that it captures big picture things and starts working on synthesizing it with other information as opposed to pegging down the little details people's names. But they spoke to 2 women and a man, each of them leaders in different houses of worship. And they expressed themselves about the current environment of ever-increasing normalcy of gun violence, right? Let's zoom back, because I'm not here to just rehash that article. I want to address this from my own perspective and from my own point of view. But I did want to applaud them. That article was deeply inspiring. It was a good listen. If you've got the chance after you've listened to this episode, go check them out, support them. And like I said, bring some of the questions that we might discuss here to those kinds of discussions out there. So let's zoom back. Let's look at this big picture. What are we talking about? In our lifetimes, and of course, those can be different, right? Depending on where you are in your life. But in my lifetime, over the past, to round down to the nearest whole decade, in the last 40 years, gun violence, quote unquote, as a social phenomena, has evolved, has developed, has changed, has grown. It was something that we were aware of, that we had experienced, and that we thought we had achieved a public, and this is foolhardy of us, those of us who felt this at any time, and of course I was a child. I'm speaking from my perspective, from the earliest awareness of the situation. That guns are guns, that they are tools designed, and people will answer that or finish that sentence a lot of different ways. But if we're really, really honest, folks, if we set aside all the propaganda about guns, positive or negative, what is a gun? What is this machine? Like, what do we do when we use it? What is the purpose? What is it designed for? What is it really about? Now, I'm not trying to be controversial. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to be accusatory. I will intellectually and morally agree with the often over-relied upon statement, right? Like, I don't disagree with the initial fact. I do think it gets leaned on a bit too heavily and inappropriately at times. That, categorically speaking, a gun is a machine, is a tool. Now, tools have purposes. And here's where I think this idea gets used in a way that can be misleading. Because the idea in and of itself is seemingly neutral. Because as expressed, the way I just stated it, which is the way it is usually used in argument, right? Well, guns are just a tool. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. The gun is just a tool, right? But you don't bring a butter knife to cut through, plywood. You don't. You need a jigsaw or one of those fancy Japanese hand saws. I forget what they're called, but the weird wedgie-shaped ones. Those are really good for cutting through relatively, small-scale wood items. You don't bring a butter knife to that. What I'm trying to say is tools, as neutral as they may appear when they're just being described as tools, have explicit purposes. Do they or do they not? Right? You don't build a drill and then use it to comb your hair. You don't buy a cement mixer and then do other things with it other than mix cement, right? Like, everything, as neutral as it may be, is incredibly specific. So when we try to defend the gun as a tool and say it's just a tool, yeah, it is a tool of death. It is a tool for killing. There's no other function that it has. We can say that, and there's a lot of spin that gets used here. We can certainly say that it is a force multiplier used to deter others' behavior. Right, at the threat of death. Or bodily harm so injurious as to be, on the verge, it could bring you to death. It's death adjacent. The explicit purpose of the machine is to propel projectiles that will pierce through and obliterate human flesh. It is not a tool of freedom. It is not a tool of self-defense. They can be used that way, I suppose, just the way a shovel could. You could use a shovel to defend your freedom. That's not its explicit purpose, though. A shovel is explicitly designed to penetrate soil and leverage it up and away from where it was sitting so you can put it somewhere else. That's what a shovel is designed to do. That's its explicit purpose. A gun is designed to split open the human flesh pod to damage it to the point of threatening its viability to continue living. To put it in a much more blunt way, guns are machines of death. Period. Now, that violent threat represented by the gun in its potentiality, that can be applied for a lot of different tactical purposes, for shizzle McNizzle, and there's no denying that. I'm not arguing that you can't use the tool for quote-unquote good purposes. What I am saying is that those who designed and continue to improve upon the design of the machine understand its explicit purpose. And they sell these machines to anyone and everyone, understanding that the explicit purpose requires a target, and that target will often be another person. And here's my point. The gun industry, the people who have manufactured this machine explicitly for butchering the human body, and then sold it to people who are inclined and or willing to use that level of violence to achieve goals, when the industry is making these sales, do you honestly, genuinely think that they are making any attempt to differentiate between you and all your buddies who are the good guys and all the people you would consider the bad guys? I humbly propose to you that they are explicitly ignoring that boundary. So, I asked the question on the cover for this show, in an era of increasingly common and seemingly normalized gun violence, explicitly targeting houses of worship, as well as, the temples of education, as well as who knows what's next, right? We had this term for a long time, going postal, because for whatever reason, like 3 decades ago, the first place that people with enough anger, enough pent-up aggression, enough dissatisfaction with the system, enough building, surging violence within them and access to guns, happened to work for the post office and happened to go into their own places of work and enact their terrorizing acts of violence at post offices. What have we done as a society since those early days as this pattern, this ever-increasing pattern of gun violence has escalated? Well, we've gotten better and better at tracking it. We now have some brutally depressing, independent third-party, fact-based statistical analysis websites like gunviolencearchive.org. Wikipedia keeps pages. Here is Wikipedia's list of mass shootings in the United States in 2019. And, the numbers are staggering. The numbers are staggering. What do we do? What do we do in light of this context and in light of this growing trend? Well, I'll tell you, I started to ask the question, what have we done? Past tense, what have we been doing? We have been arguing about the supposed rights. And I'll mind you, the reason I use the word supposed, to finish my sentence, the supposed right to amass and collect these machines of butchering each other uninhibited, whether or not that's a God-given right is debatable. Many people have a vision of God, an image of God, an idol of God in their minds, that is implicitly a vengeful, spiteful, angry God that will indeed overtly pit you, his chosen ones, against them, everybody else. Now, isn't that interesting that some versions of how people envision God include a dogmatic, ideological, brainwashing, programming code of us versus them? That's fascinating. This is truly curious and mind-boggling to me, because even within those versions of that belief system, where that's overt and explicit and perfectly allowed and totally normal, and thus, people render hate inspired by religious doctrine, what's mind-boggling and truly disturbing to me about it is that those models are drawing from the same source material as, everyone else who has this image of a peaceful, loving God that wants us all to get along. How did we get there? How do we get to a place where people who share their community, who share a common civic bond, who share a national identity, are so divided and so angry about this issue that they cannot see how we as a market pool of potential consumers are manipulated by this industry that sells us these machines so we can then turn around and use them. So in that article that inspired me to focus on this subject, one of the religious leaders, a woman, was discussing her experience witnessing one congregation, other than her own, a congregation she was visiting, cope with the question of whether or not they were put armed guards around their services. And this was after an attack on a primarily white church. And her reaction was really quite eye-opening. And this is something that many people from all walks of life may, have easily let slip from the forefront of their mind, generally speaking, and not, may not have insight into what it means right away, but with a little bit of sitting with it, you can come to some really clear comprehension. All right, she was a leader of a black church, and she was explaining how it was almost absurd to her, the discussion going on about the optics of having armed guards at a religious service, because from her perspective, that has been her experience her whole spiritual life. She has grown up in a community where her primarily black church, or black churches that she attended or visited or that were part of her experience, always had armed guards, because the history of violence committed against black churches has been going on for a lot longer than this recent ramp up against Christian and now Muslim churches, or temples, Jewish temples, etc. Right? So, and what I wanted to key into was that perspective, right? That this is the norm. Think about it. This is the norm here in the richest, wealthiest, supposedly safest country in the world, that going to church, going to the temple where, and let's not get into the argument of which church is right, okay? Let's set that aside. Let's be secular about that question and just acknowledge that at these different houses of worship, at these different temples of spiritual practice, there has been, for many years, in a very us versus them, pit one against the other kind of way, an ever-increasing onslaught of predatory violence. And that some communities are only just now wrestling with the question of how to react, how to respond, how to brace yourselves, how to protect the community, how to defend this temple, right? And some communities are accustomed to dealing with these issues, and the future, the trend as it's moving forward, seems to indicate a possible future, a probability wave function that we could get sucked into, let's say, to use sci-fi terminology for a hot second, that we could be unfolding a fractal pathway, to use much more appropriate spiritual terminology, wherein we invoke, welcome, invite, create for ourselves, even though it is not what we want, a world in which physical violence at these temples becomes some form of tolerated norm. And that, like in other places that we dismissively call third world countries, routine, bloody violence must just be tolerated and incorporated and coped with and lived around. Now, to some people, that sounds crazy. The fact of the matter is that in many places in the world, this is already achieved. This is already the new norm. This is already what happens. Just look at, the Palestinian situation. We can argue about which side is right. We can pick sides and say these guys are the bad guys and those guys are the good guys and let's fight. Or we can realize that two tribes of people have become habitually entrenched in an attempt to destroy each other. For what? For what? I ask the question, how can we move forward in this era as clearly, and this is controversial, and plenty of gun advocates, gun enthusiasts, gun culture, people entrenched in gun culture are either confused or offended by the following statement. But we are being herded, manipulated, influenced, encouraged to destroy each other. And I'm not the first to raise this flag. Let's pause for a moment. Something that I failed to do because I was tragically too busy with the boring details of everyday, life and day job and stuff. And also sort of overwhelmed because several people in my personal sphere passed away within the same week. But earlier, and also on that point, should anyone that knows me personally and or may know anybody I'm referencing, condolences, and my love goes out to everybody who's lost anybody. Death is always a challenging thing to process when it is not our own. And of course, it is something we live in fear of. I've done plenty of discussion about that, and I'm sure I'll come back and do a whole episode on death and my thoughts on it. But right now, I just want to send love and energy and compassion to the people I know and to everybody around the world that's lost somebody. And then to sort of emblematically use someone that passed away recently. Then this, I want to acknowledge and send love and condolences out to everybody who's feeling the loss of, and I'm stalling here because I just totally blanked on his name and it's terrible. I'm such a horrible, horrible talk show personality host. Who just passed away this week? John, the director of Boyz II Men. No, damn it. Boys in the Hood. Boyz II Men is a band. John Singleton. Thank you, Internet. Blessed, our brains are being handicapped by the ease of, we can just access the information whenever we can't remember it. So where am I going with this? Okay, so to take a moment and have a moment of respect for John Singleton, who passed away. He was a shining example of a human being that could be considered evidence to the contrary of the generally evil and malicious direction that most conspiracy theorists might insist that the Hollywood industry is going. And who knows, maybe he is an exception to that. Maybe he isn't, and he's a double agent. Who knows? I don't know. And I don't mean to be rude to anybody who looks up to and admires John Singleton. To the best of my ability to discern, I appreciate his work, and I do not feel that he is one of those Hollywood types that was caught up in the dark side. If there's a dark side, there must be a light side. That's my central counter-argument to all the nefarious theories, is if there's a nefarious movement going on in this industry or that industry, there must, by the very rules of the universe, and I'm talking at the organic, undeniable, we may not understand them, but they cannot be denied they exist, by the fundamental way the world, I mean the universe works, there must also be, for lack of a better term, agents of the light side. And I humbly propose that John Singleton seems to have been one of those. And why am I bringing him up? Well, other than to say condolences to all those who are missing him, family or fans, etc., otherwise, and to say, hey, if you've never seen his work, go watch it. He's one of those bold voices. In his debut film, Boys in the Hood, there is a brilliantly powerful, eloquent, elegant, and simple scene that lays the fucking truth out. And I don't have it queued up because I don't remember what the scene is generally popularly referred to as, but they played it on the radio the other day, and here's my attempt to paraphrase the quote. And if I'm not mistaken, it's Lawrence Fishburne speaking in this scene, and he's talking to either his son or one of the friends of his kids. His son is played by Cuba Gooding Jr. And the line that I want to highlight from the movie goes something along the lines of, do you want to talk about guns? Let's talk about guns. Why do you think there's a gun store on every corner of this community? Why? Why do you think? No one answers, right? I think he's talking to a group of kids. It's I'll tell you why. So the same reason there's a liquor store at every corner of this black community. There's a liquor store, and here I'm totally butchering the quote, right? I'm paraphrasing and or expressing it in my own words. But literally, also, he says basically this. There's a liquor store and a gun shop in every corner of this and most other black communities because they want us to kill ourselves. And I say to you, my dear friends, to any of you listening, whether you love guns or you hate guns, I'm not making an argument for taking the guns away. Let's not go down that ridiculous rabbit hole. What I am saying is that no matter how useful they might be as a tool, the agenda behind the industry that profiteers on selling you the tool, selling me the tool, selling that shady-ass motherfucker over there the tool, and selling that crazy Nazi the tool, and selling that crazy insert your favorite extremist right here, because they all have access to guns. And they all get them from somewhere. And we can keep romanticizing and pretending that the industry only righteously sells to law-abiding citizens and that it's criminals that somehow then traffic the guns away. But the industry, to the best of my ability to discern, makes absolutely zero effort to prevent any of that quote-unquote gun trafficking from happening. And in many ways, I'm sure it becomes clear once you look from a bigger perspective, it cannot be denied that the industry perpetuates an us versus them mentality that facilitates any individual's personal ego thinking to lead them to the irrational conclusion that they have the right to shoot the other person because the other person is one of them. And the problem with us versus them thinking is that it seems correct and true and righteous regardless of what group you belong to. Every group is the self-righteous us that believes that all the other groups are the unrighteous them. And we live in a time and in a moment in history where, quite frankly, it seems to some of us observing that organized religion, for all of its various positive influences, which cannot be denied, all organized religion has also been encumbered, burdened by deep and powerful corruption. And that this corruption is being leveraged to pit all organized religion against all other organized religion. I humbly propose to you, my friends, that whether you are of this organized religion or that organized religion, whether you're an atheist or a spiritual mystic or insert your favorite label here, the threat of this agenda to create and foster as much conflict as possible in order to exponentially increase gun sales, which unavoidably leads to an escalation in gun violence, that this problem is something we must take a spiritual stand against. We must stand our spiritual ground. And as with any sort of interfaith coexist, multi-religion sort of movement, multi-faith, interdisciplinary spiritual organization, we must anchor ourselves in forgiveness, or else we will not achieve the healing required. Transcend the boundaries of these different ideological models that we have become attached to in order to identify how those models pit us against each other. And in identifying that, through transcending the boundaries of us versus them, we heal ourselves and each other, right? Which is, of course, at the center of my whole manifesto. That if we truly must, it's not my manifesto, but if we truly must, of this manifesto, if we truly want to manifest change, it must be change that it must be a kind of change that is anchored in healing. Otherwise, the change will only fall into the same ego traps and or be hijacked by the same hijackers and or be corrupted by the same corruption that has led us to where we are now. All right, I'm going to stop rambling. Going to leave it there, friends. But I am hopefully not leaving you in a place of confusion or disillusionment, right? Like, my point is not to get depressed about the violence, to not get depressed about the seemingly powerful way with which those who are committed to commit these sorts, they're determined to commit these sorts of acts, it can appear that they have the advantage, right? Because we can't identify them until it's almost too late. But that's a limitation that's entirely caused by a reliance on externalized, non-spiritual thinking. Why? And here's what all of the arguing about guns and gun rights doesn't address, and why I'm trying to push past that argument. I'm not trying to have an argument about the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is clear, well regulated. I'm sorry. And also, you at home are not a militia. I'm sorry. So well-regulated militia to me reads as there must be some structure that organizes the need to use that tool and regulates it. Now, I'm not saying take away all the guns either. What I'm saying is don't flip that inside out so that it sounds like everybody and their crazy uncle should be stockpiling guns. Because that's not what the Founding Fathers were suggesting. And that's not what we need. That's what the gun industry wants. To me, it's obvious, right? To me, if you step back from the NRA's messaging, what they're ultimately peddling is ever-increasing gun sales. At what cost? An ever-escalating amount of gun violence. And let me tell you, friends, that cannot be stopped by more gun violence. The very attitude that a bad guy with a gun can only be stopped by a good guy with a gun is dependent on the notion that the only tool anyone can use is a gun. There is a plethora of spiritual tools at our disposal that are in ways dramatically different than a bullet tearing through the body, as powerful than a gun. Now that sounds like a crazy thing to say, right? Because I can't shoot love beams at my eyeballs to stop a gunman, right? I can't. No, I know. I understand that. I'm not crazy. I don't think I have superpowers, right? I'm not pretending to be a hero the way a certain someone said that they would totally run in there unarmed to stop a gunman, right? I love that meme that's like, claims he would run in first to stop a gunman, and then it's like picture of bald eagle flapping its wings and him looking scared as shit. I love that meme. I'll put it to you this way. As a spiritual person, as a person who looks at the world from a we are each other, we have always been each other, the differences are only the personality mask that we wear, and that at the center of our being, behind that personality mask, you and I are exactly the same consciousness. I will tell you that the conflict over guns can only play out one of two extreme ways, I think. Is there a middle ground? Well, there's always a third path, right? There's always a third option. That's one of Buddha's sort of hidden messages. When you find two extremes, there's always a third path. But right now, the two extremes that I worry about is one in which the gun fearmongers manifest their fear, and we really do build a tyrannical system for ourselves that really does take away our guns and then uses that power against us. Because when you masturbate, when you have fear-mongering is a kind of mental masturbation, and when you indulge in the consumption of fear-mongering and the perpetuation or the peddling, the repeddling, the regurgitation of fear-mongering, you're essentially voting for that, right? Did a whole episode about that. Our minds are voting machines for the matrix we call the universe. And the matrix tries to manifest what we vote for. So any kind of fear-mongering is always like a double reverse psychology, double mindfuck. Let's break that down. For 8 years, the fear-mongering got peddled that Obama was coming for your guns. People lived in fear of that. People spewed and regurgitated that fear for 8 years. For 8 years, the left tried to convince everyone else for some reasonable gun control measures. Now, I'm not trying to sanctify the left. They've got their own weird way of being corrupt, and there's a whole nother episode to have there. But on the gun issue, they're not playing the game the way the right is. They're playing, they're pretending to be the good guys. They're they're wearing the white hat when it comes to the gun issue. And they really are presenting reasonable control measures that will not solve the gun problem, but are reasonable control measures that might help reduce it a little bit. It won't solve it, but it will help catch some of the problem because, they just want ID checks and stuff, and they just want to put a limit to the power of the ease by which we can butcher each other, right? Like what the opposite end wants everyone to have, massive futuristic howitzer railguns or something, laser beam railguns that just whatever. My point is that those 8 years went by and Obama never sent out death squads to steal your guns away and shoot you, right? But gun sales went through the roof. Gun sales went through the roof on all sides. And as an extension of that, with gun sales gone through the roof, more people have access to guns. And as we know, it's people who kill people with guns. And the more people that have access to absurdly powerful guns in absurdly large amounts. And it's always been the case, like who commits these shootings? Well, school shootings are primarily committed by kids who illegally acquired their guns through family members who acquired them legally, right? And that's the problem. Now, we won't solve the problem by fighting over who has the right to own what guns. We might solve the problem by transcending our addiction to killing each other as a means to solve problems. We might solve the problem, right, by healing all of the trauma at an individual level and at a species-wide level of those that are so traumatized that they become convinced that only gun violence will make them feel better. That's how we're going to solve the problem. We're only going to solve the problem when we acknowledge, recognize, and hold accountable a gun industry that doesn't give two flying fucks about your rights, that doesn't give a shit about your safety, that just wants you to buy more and more guns. And that doesn't give a shit who you are as long as you buy more guns. An industry that is selling the guns to the bad guys who are killing the good guys trying to protect the innocent people without guns, right? It's a vicious cycle. And the only people that benefit are the gun industry. So where's the outrage? Where's the holding them accountable? It's happening, slowly but surely. Have you seen the recent wave of crazy news coming out of the NRA? I'm going to have to pause here and make a whole special episode about that because I've rambled on long enough for this segment. As always, thank you, my friends, for tuning in. And I hope that by bringing this question to the foreground, we might start organizing as spiritual people, as spiritual practitioners, regardless of brand, regardless of faith, regardless of demographic, regardless of country of origin, etc., etc., etc. That if we take our spiritual practices seriously, whether you're praying to Yeshua or praying to the much more whiteified Jesus, whether you are practicing what Buddha taught or you're following in the footsteps of Krishna, if we take our spiritual work seriously, then we understand that the commonalities of all those spiritual practices are tools that will facilitate the healing and transformation, positive transformation of the human species, right? Not because this religion or that religion, this guru or that guru, this prophet or that prophet said so, but because all of those attempts at describing the universe, as flawed as they might be, as corrupt as they might appear now, did indeed capture some nuggets of truth which point towards the center. And that center has some shit in common. Love, forgiveness, transformative healing. Let's organize around those principles. If we organize and take action around those principles, I guarantee you that in another 40 years' time, things will be radically different. And if we organize around those principles and dig deeper than the surface level that we're allowed to acknowledge and start working on the esoteric level, the energy level, the frequency level, the level of where love actually operates, the level where forgiveness actually manifests, the level where transformative healing actually unfolds its magic, then we will solve the problem even faster. As always, my friends, I hope that peace-loving grooviness is blossoming in your heart. Until next time, this has been your absurdly crazy, spirally thinking, totally always underprepared but earnest and sincere spiritual cannabis mystic, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily Zencast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.